I usually start my shows usually having a pre-conversation, and then I say, "Hey, we're recording now," and that's pretty
Oh
much
yeah,
it.
yeah.
Okay.
I figured I would just stream it on my end because my audience might be interested, but yeah. But we're live. All right, well let's do it then, Nevin. Why not?
All righty. Well, welcome to my program, and I'm honored to be your guest on your program. I really appreciate that. I want to have this conversation with you about your essay. I know it's generated quite a bit of controversy in YouTube, Twitch, political circles. I want to talk about the general issues of capitalism and socialism, the issue of, I know it came up in the discussion with Connor and Wick and others about the tanky infiltration of the Democratic Party. I think there's a lot of grains in truth and a variety of different viewpoints, but there's always a lot of nuance that seems to get lost. So I want to talk about a variety of these issues. I know you've read some of my essays, so feel free to ask me about my views. I would definitely appreciate the engagement and kind of the mental massage, as one of my colleagues at work refers to it. So I wanted to ask you, how did you become a socialist? I know you discussed it in your essay, your interactions listening to Matt Brunig and of course I think it was a Norwegian investment banker and another Scandinavian economist. The names escape me, I'm sorry. But why did you become a socialist? Did you ever start out as a conservative and libertarian? If so, what made you abandon that ultimately?
Yeah. I mean, my political journey has really always been tinted left. Pretty much ever since I was a young child, first kind of getting into politics. I think that part of it was my upbringing, and part of it was also kind of my early career where I worked in fast food for 2 years when I was a teenager, essentially. And I saw just how completely fucking miserable the workplace was when you didn't have things like unions, right? And so I was like, okay, well, at least as a very basic, starting point, right? It's like, okay, things like unions seem to be like really important because I know how miserable I was without one, and they're not perfect. But it was like, okay, unions seem pretty important. And obviously, growing up, the only party that ever gave even a little bit of a shit about unions was the Democratic Party. So I was kind of sort of tilted toward that direction. And I don't think at the time I could really express why, right? Like, I don't know that I had the words, but, now I think that in hindsight and in the present, I just have, number one, kind of a solidarity of people who, in general, a sense of community. And I think that especially when, I think that when we look at the kind of misery associated with the inequalities of society, whether that be like the inequalities of power or power relationships, or certainly the inequalities associated with poverty and lack of income, it just, to me, the only way to really solve those issues from everything that I've been able to survey is not just more capitalism, right? It's more of kind of the opposite, right? It's more of redistribution and taxes, and it's more things like unionization, and of course now I say it's more socialism, right? So that's kind of how I started up and how I kind of ended up being a tilt left person in general. But overall, I've always been kind of on the progressive wing of the party. I went from, I guess you could say, like an extreme liberal who wouldn't call myself a socialist to now just an extreme liberal who would call myself a socialist, but I'm still basically a Bernie voter.
Yeah, and your essay, and we can have just a freewheeling conversation, maybe even all over the place, perhaps, I'm sure at some points. But even your essay, part 3, and again, maybe I'm misquoting it, but I don't think I am. It does allow private ownership and billionaires. You actually explicitly don't rule it out and saying they can't exist. It's almost like you're developing a mixed economy, but with more state ownership. I think you say 85 to 90% would be owned by these public wealth funds and whatnot. It's very interesting. I think what you're trying to do is really flesh out a lot of the pitfalls. You explicitly address that again in your third part, which I think is your strongest from my point of view. The part 3 of your essay, where you're trying to flesh out the issues of inefficiency, capital allocation, the democracy issue. You clearly differentiate yourself from Marxist-Leninists. I don't understand, and it quite frankly pisses me off, and people can Google my name, and you've read my works. I am a fierce anti-communist. I'm fiercely anti-Marxist-Leninist, anti-National Socialist, anti-fascist. And you have debated these individuals. You debated a guy, I forget his name, from the now defunct neo-fascist group New Frontier USA, as well as also several individual Marxist-Leninists. And I'm going to be honest with you. Do you think people actually read your essays, even glanced at it? Because where are they getting this view that your brand of socialism going through it, plus your evidence of, I mean, look, you're very polite with your viewers, but you did get a little frustrated. You were challenging the fascists as well as the communist or Marxist-Leninist types. So I really don't see it, but where do you think people are getting that from? Do you think there's a confusion? Is your interview with Matt McManus, who's also been on my show, he's a great guest, very erudite fellow. Do you think people are conflating just socialism and just saying it's all basically Marxism, Leninism, or fascism, National Socialism, Baathism, or whatever? What's going on here? Because I'm a little perplexed.
Yeah, I mean, I think honestly, what you find is that there are a lot of Marxist-Leninists, and there's also kind of a lot of I guess like you might call them like agitating in a number of senses of the word, like agitating socialists online. Where, you've got this mix of like, there's a lot of socialists who aren't necessarily Marxist-Leninists, but they can be kind of irritating people in a number of ways. It's kind of an odd group of people. And I think obviously the Marxist-Leninists can be very disagreeable as well. And so given that that's a decent portion of like the sort of anger and boisterousness from socialists online, I think there's just a lot of people like Connor and Destiny and just everyone, basically everyone who's had that criticism, where I think that kind of the story boils down to they've had a really bad interpersonal experience with a lot of online socialists, and they're not really able to see the sort of actually existing diverse history of socialism and diverse movement of socialism. And that's one thing that I tried to get across, but unfortunately it does seem like kind of a losing battle, because I had people. There was a guy I was responding to a guy on Reddit the other day who was like, you didn't make this clear at all in your debate with Destiny. I was like, what, I'm just going to take the time. I found the timestamp where I explicitly explained the exact thing that he was talking about. And he's like, okay, fair enough. You did make that clear, but a lot of people still felt like you didn't. And I'm like, okay, well, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Like, all I can do is say the words, and hopefully people can resonate with them. I mean, it does feel a little bit frustrating, because I do honestly feel like a lot of people, I think they're very close-minded when it comes to the label of socialist because of that negative interpersonal history. And I don't know that that's necessarily unfair. Like, if you've had just like an overwhelmingly negative experience with a group of people who call themselves a certain thing, and then all of a sudden someone that, was previously ingratiated in a community calls themselves the same thing, you're probably more likely to be negative on that person than to be charitable to the label. That's kind of descriptively true, but certainly I think it is a little frustrating, because I do think, like, from my perspective, I don't know, like I always had like a pretty clean ability to segregate these people in my head, right? Like, I was always willing to talk to people. Like, for me at least, socialism, I guess in part maybe because I was a Bernie supporter, and it's like, well, he called himself a socialist. Maybe there's some like intuitions in my head that I couldn't quite vocalize, but I never quite treated socialism like Nazism as a label. Like, if someone calls themselves a Nazi, there's not like an actually existing diverse history of righteous Nazis, right? Like, that doesn't really exist. But when I look at socialism, I can look at a lot of socialists who, had very liberatory things, socialists who founded healthcare systems across the world, socialists who believed in egalitarianism, democracy, almost all the welfare states and all the, most major countries except for America, essentially, were founded by socialists. There was a clip someone sent me. I hadn't seen the clip previously, but I knew who Olof Palme was in Sweden, there's a clip of Olaf Palm explaining why he's a socialist. I guess in some sort of political debate he was involved in, and he kind of goes through like, oh, well, the reason I'm a socialist is because I believe in, solidarity. I believe in people making a reasonable wage. I believe in, people being able to afford their basic standard of living. And he goes through kind of like all this background philosophy for why he calls himself a socialist. And I think it was maybe Lonerbox when I spoke to him who said something along the lines of, that's true, but you have to keep in mind, like, there's a reason why maybe like Europeans and Oceania parties are, it's not quite as controversial to use the word socialist because America didn't have its own kind of distinct socialist left-wing movement. We've always had, at least in broader contemporary American history, basically just the Democrats, which is a liberal party, not really certainly never been a socialist party in nature. And maybe descriptively that's true, but I just think that a lot of people as well, they've had this other criticism of like, well, essentially there's so many loud, boisterous, like bad people, I guess, who use the word socialist. So even you using that label is in some way siding with them or something like that. And it's like, I don't know. I just don't really, I tend to think in magnitudes in that regard. Like I use the example of Republican, right? I think honestly, if you were to think about the stigma associated with two words, like the general ethos, there's probably more stigma associated with Republican than with socialist, right? At least depending on the circles that you run in at the Democratic Party, right? Like if you were to go into the DNC and, say I'm a Republican versus say I'm a socialist, I'd imagine I'm a Republican would get you more nasty looks than I'm a socialist. And I don't, maybe they would say that's a bad thing, but I would just say like, look, I just don't know that saying I'm a Republican is like an inherently bad thing just because MAGA's taken over the Republican Party. And so similarly, I don't know that it's fair to say like, you basically just shouldn't use the label because you've got this like group of Marxist-Leninists online who are, are bad people, really annoying, like whatever the word you'd want to use is. I've never really, I don't know. Some labels are like that. Again, there's no such thing as a good Nazi, right? But I mean, if you just look at the history of socialism, it does seem like there's a such thing as a good socialist. And so I'd like to think I'm part of that tradition.
Yeah, I can see where your roots are coming from. I mean, getting back to Destiny and Connor now, I really have not interacted with Destiny, but I do follow his work. One of the things that is, I consider myself a capitalist, but more in the tradition of the New Deal, the American School of Economics, which I'm sure you're familiar with, of Henry Clay, Henry Carey, Abraham Lincoln, the early Republicans, the Whigs, Alexander Hamilton. And also one of my favorite presidents was Teddy Roosevelt, of course, minus the aspects of the raw colonialism and the Platt Amendment of 1901, because I believe every country should at least have their own nationalism and controlled to a large degree their own destiny. Of course, we have to take into account as Americans our own national security needs to as well, and there has to be a balance. But with that stated, Destiny, there are some overlaps, I think, with some of our views with him, but there is a real disturbing edge that kind of triggers me really in a bad way. It's this sort of hardcore bootstrap type of thing, like with his tweets. If you don't mind me reading, just in case the audience may not be familiar with, and because there's a big difference between Destiny and Connor. And Connor is a friend of mine. I've been on his show. I've met him and his family. He's a good guy. He is very unusual, I think, for a number of conservatives. He's really more of what used to be termed a radical centrist, who kind of, he has a lot of mildly progressive kind of views coexisting with a lot of conservative goals. Connor, if you're listening, if I'm misrepresenting you, text me or let me know. But, there's a big difference. He is a very empathetic, compassionate, kind person who's definitely approachable. And maybe I just say that because I'm biased, but I tend to do that with friends. Like if I stick up for you, I'm doing it also based on the evidence, what I see, what I hear. With Destiny, again, I've never met him. He's very bright. He is a good communicator, but I have a lot of problems with some of his core positions. Like he tweeted in response to the assassinations, for example, of the United Healthcare executive, Mr. Thompson. He's like, the problem is you don't want the basics. You want a premium middle-class lifestyle, a house or a roomy apartment with no roommates, high-quality food, extras like Starbucks, a decent vehicle, budget for some entertainment, the ability to save up a decent amount of extra income every month, all from 40-hour fast food job, which, by the way, according to BLS statistics, this is my interjection, since the 1980s, those low-wage service, low benefit or no benefit jobs has been the employment engine of the economy, particularly with people not with degrees, but increasingly with college degrees. And I continue, this will probably never be realistic. These jobs are transitional. They're not meant to be the final destination for most workers. And then he also writes on another post, this year, Americans want literally everything and then cry when all of it isn't provided for free. It sounds like he was denied a medical trial to do a double lung transplant, which isn't even part of the ordinary ways to treat stage 4 lung cancer. Sometimes people get sick and die. It sucks, but there is not always a greedy capitalist to blame for it. Now, that's deeply disturbing. And look, I'm a free speech guy. I'm a librarian by profession, so I'm all for free speech, free exchange. But I got to tell you, that shit pisses me off and triggers me big time for a lot of reasons. Number one, I just generally don't like people like that lack compassion. I understand I'm not a total egalitarian. There's always going to be a certain level of natural inequalities, but I also believe in balancing that with a sense of empathy and compassion. Why? Because it makes your system look good to the rest of the world. It gives the people in your country a sense that you're a part of the system. The system likes you. It cares about you. And there's also a national security element too as well. We know from the publications of DSA, the Party of Socialism and Liberation, two examples, this was in my last Substack essay on Remaking the Right, that since Trump was reelected, although there's some controversy on that, really how legitimate that is, but in any case, those groups are growing. When you interview the people why, people like Danny Haiphong, for example, who's kind of tied in with Communist China and the Workers' World Party and that whole milieu, it's because they've been fucked over by highly financialized capitalism. That's what it comes down to. And these messages that I just read, purportedly coming from a quote-unquote liberal and a quote-unquote capital D Democrat, those sentiments are more at home with MAGA. And there's more people need to call out that shit. And maybe I'm the first streamer that's doing that, but it really fucking pisses me off. And normally I don't get pissed. I'm like you. I don't get pissed usually, but that stuff is dangerous. I had a friend of mine, his name is Kenny Stolman, who's no longer with us, young guy. He was in the Party of Communist USA. He defected. And he told me that Angelo, who was the party chairman, it was a splinter group from the CPUS that's even more Stalinist than Stalinist. And he told me that Angelo said, down here in Florida, the propaganda writes itself. Show the statements of a Destiny or a Ron DeSantis or certain libertarian and so-called conservative economists, scholars, et cetera, show their callousness, because we don't have to do work and make up shit. We could just say, see, here's the video of a Ben Shapiro or whoever that says empathy is bad in politics, for example. And it's just, they fulfill the caricature. But Angelo said the propaganda writes itself. And before he defected from the party, he recruited 3 or 4 people based on that. That's a problem in my eyes. So you're going to have some thoughts. So feel free to interject, please.
Yeah, I think it is. I think that is probably bad rhetoric, just because I think it's sensible to be aspirational, I guess, right? Like I guess I don't find it to be a big problem in politics for people to kind of really advocate for everything they really want to see out of society, right? I mean, I guess there are probably some practical limitations, and you don't want to be totally idealistic, but I think maybe that's more, that's more of a brute practical concern, right? Like, for instance, if I ran for, I've said this about Mamdani, right? That like Mamdani there probably was just a brute practical reason why he didn't talk about socializing the means of production when he ran for office, because obviously, as just being the mayor of New York, it would be impossible to do that. Probably couldn't do that over one term or two terms anyway. And then number three, it's just a confusing thing that most people aren't going to understand. It's socialism and that kind of rhetoric is just such a niche thing that just the actual ground level practicality doesn't make sense. But I heard a lot of people with Mamdani's campaign, they criticized by saying, you can't do this, that you have to get this approved by the state legislature, and that's never going to happen. And look, I don't know. I mean, on one hand, I do understand the thought process of basically only run on what you can really promise and what you can really get done. But at the same time, you have to build out these movements somehow, right? I mean, the only way to really start them is to at least say what you really want and at least start the negotiations with that, right? So although I do recognize the criticism of, hey, there's downside risk here, people will be disappointed when it doesn't get done. At the same time, you have to put things into the political consciousness for them to even have potential in the first place. I take the example of take Andrew Yang, right? Andrew Yang totally failed presidential candidate in every way. He never won a caucus. He never really was a mainstream candidate. But I'll say that, probably one thing that he did do that was really, really positive and clear is that he did inject universal basic income into the political ethos to a much higher degree than it was before. I don't know that most people know what universal basic income is, but I'd imagine it went from 1% to 20% or something like that. A pretty meaningfully large increase in the number of people who at least could tell you what it is. Which is a much kind of more stable ground to advocate for if that's a policy that you favor. And Bernie did that with so many different policies when he ran, even though he lost, right? And even though he ran a very aspirational campaign. So, I don't know. I do understand in part where people like that are coming from, but I think ultimately, number one, it's not clear that political strategy is workable. It seems quite fraught to tell people, oh, well, actually, we can only get this very skinny platform done. So it's not clear you'd get votes if you campaigned that way. At least not as a non-incumbent. Maybe an incumbent could get away with like, oh, we could only do so much, and this is what I'm, maybe because you've got the incumbency advantage. But outside of that, it seems like that's not the greatest political strategy, both in terms of actually getting elected, but then, like you said, in terms of inspiring people. It does inspire, I guess, to be fair, Ron DeSantis, like people like that. There are a lot of people in this country that really do think that way. That is a winnable message for a lot of people. But if you're talking about a left coalition, somebody with Democrat next to their name, certainly somebody in the DSA, right? I mean, the only way you're going to win, I think, is to have what I think to be a pretty biting criticism of, not necessarily like the capitalist structure of society, right? But a biting criticism of the destitution around us and how that's, a very, very ridiculous thing, whether you're coming at it from a kind of center-left redistributionist perspective, or you're coming at it from, a socialist perspective where you want to really alter the economic system itself. In a left-wing space, you really do need to, you need to have that kind of critique, I think, to make voters really care about it. To the extent that right-wingers, like some right-wingers will say, I think I've even heard like Cenk Uygur say things like this, where like, no, the right-wing base is actually very critical of our economic system, and you could totally get them to vote for these progressive economic priorities. And it's like, okay, like to the extent that you could find a poll that shows that Republicans want to raise the minimum wage, it's clear that they just don't prioritize those issues. Like they still vote for Republicans, right? Like it's clear that to the extent that you can vote for either people who prioritize populist economics in a real sense, redistributionist stuff, raising the minimum wage, public ownership, that's the Democrats that do that, not the Republicans. But they vote for the Republicans, right? So it's clear to me that they're prioritizing, some sense of nationalism, right? Maybe they really care about protectionism, immigration, things like that, right? And I just, it's not clear to me that you could walk into rural Florida and start preaching about socialism and get many votes, even though they might agree with you on, in some basic sense, that there's problems in the economy.
Yeah, no, I mean, all interesting points that you make. And one of the things where I think you mentioned it in your first part of your essay, where you talk about after your discussions and reviewing of Matt Bruning's works, about when Matt Bruning defined socialism as the collective ownership of the means of production. And then, of course, it started to turn the wheels in your brain. And it's like, oh, that could mean public schools, fire department, it's police, etc. And then I'm thinking to myself, holy crap, maybe I'm a socialist and I didn't know
Right.
it,
Public
given my
libraries, right?
platform. But I view my positions as more, when people go through my essays, I know you went through my What is Radical Civic Nationalism essay. It's very pragmatic, it's very practical, it's not totally egalitarian. It's a combination with idealism, with really what has worked in history and what is not. You have to have a, I agree with you and others when I say I strongly believe in the notion of entrepreneurialism, aspirations, moving up the ladder and everything else. But we also have to understand, as you do, obviously, and many in your audience, people have to have resources in order to have opportunities. Look, I was able, for example, after my divorce, I was able to give a personal example to lose weight, get back into a health situation and everything else. Why? Because I had money to join a gym and then during COVID buy equipment. You need resources. You need work-life balance in a career that gives you time off with predictable scheduling. And this is how I kind of look at the world. You have to look at the lived experiences, the data, and then come up with policy. And another thing I really loved about your essay, I've had on my program Pat Choate. He's an economist. He worked, consulted for local, state, and federal governments. He was Ross Perot's vice presidential running mate in 1996, and I've become friendly with him. He's a really cool guy. I might ask him if I could network you too. I know you're retiring, but he mentions the same thing you mentioned in the essay, where in your, I think it was number 1, where you talked about when you, in classic economics education, the 99% of economics graduates receive, students don't spend much time talking about socialism or capitalism. You might have the odd professor here or there who makes an offhand comment, or maybe you'll have a slide defining socialism and capitalism in a lecture, but that's about it. And it's true. I took economics classes at Florida Atlantic University. The professor was a very good communicator, but really did not go into those issues. I had to read about it myself, learn about it, because I, in my history classes, because that was my undergraduate major, double major in history and political science. But it wasn't always like that, economy. You probably know.
Yeah.
What I understand from Pat Choate, he said that there used to be the more, the historical school that used to be taught about economic history. What is the economic theory of capitalism, socialism, fascism, communism? And another point, there are so many different flavors of capitalism and socialism that means 1,001 different people. The Nazis called themselves socialists. Olaf Palm, who you referenced, calls himself a socialist. You call yourself a socialist. Caleb Maupin and the other Marxist-Leninists, although he kind of rebranded it himself, and I think he's just practicing deception, to be honest with you. He's a bright guy, but nevertheless, all claim themselves adhering to some form of socialism or another. There are many different forms of capitalism. I would argue I represent a form of capitalism. Then you have people like Ron DeSantis or the Libertarian Party or Destiny or others that have different definitions of capitalism. Nick Hanauer, who's one of my best, probably one of my biggest heroes in the business world. I'm sure you're familiar with his work and his podcast, Pitchfork Economics. And he said it's capitalism, defining capitalism is like, there's different varieties. Sometimes it's dirt pie, which tastes like shit. And then you have cherry pie, which tastes great, unless you don't like it, of course. So, that's how I view the whole capitalism socialism debate here. And one of the things I wanted to talk to you about when it comes to the investments in these public holding companies, if I'm using the correct definition that you used in the essay, there's also, I know you are open to foreign investment, and I call myself a sensible moderate protectionist. Is, as you know from our last conversation, I think Trump's handling of the tariffs is a disaster. I think Kyle Kulinski hit it. I don't know if seems he listens to your podcast. Maybe he's listening now. Kyle, I agree with you. And I've said this on my podcast. Trump has not accompanied it with proper holistic industrial policy. You can't have effective tariffs without gradually introducing them. It's like a drug patient. If you're addicted to cheap goods for decades, are you going to basically recommend treatment that just jolts the person overnight? No, you're not going to do that with an alcoholic. You're not going to do that with a drug patient. And the same should apply with tariffs and industrial policy. And I'll get to my question about your essay. What I believe about industrial policy, there should be a gradual implementation of tariffs or of that. I know Coalition for Prosperous America says instead of that, instead of traditional tariffs, you could use that, which most of the world uses as a sort of informal tariff. I would like to see a ban on stock buybacks. I know that's something that's widely defended by conservatives. I know Destiny defends that, which is shocking to me. But that's a misallocation of capital, because from the benefits are derived from the various tax cuts, particularly under George W. Bush and Trump. These large amounts of the profits are reinvested into basically share buybacks, which benefits the majority shareholders. And I know I'm not the only person that has pointed that out. There's statistics. I've written about it and other people have. Ban stock buybacks so capital is allocated towards research and development, production, salaries, etc., training, hiring, blah, blah, blah. I would also do tuition-free education for certain targeted majors, particularly STEM majors and trade schools. I would also take a look at banning right to work. I would take a look at FDR's second Bill of Rights, which would include mass unionization, as long as the unions are pretty centrist and moderate, that they have an understanding that businesses garnering profits is actually a good thing. No communist or neo-fascist type of infiltrators. And they do exist in this country as well as elsewhere, historically and even currently. It's not a good thing in my eyes. I would take a look at nationalizing the Federal Reserve. I'm basically ripping off the American School of Economics and Alexander Hamilton, create it and use it not only, of course, to promote or to fight inflation and to promote full employment, which is its missions, from what I understand. But I would also take a look at it serving as the old Reconstruction Finance Corporation to pump money back into jumpstarting long dormant or already impaired industries. So my point is I know you, getting to my question, just to elaborate on my aspects of my industrial policy, where is the national security concerns? And I know you're concerned about national security because you're not a friend of Russia and China. I know that. But my concern is you allow foreign investment, which is totally cool, not against foreign investment per se, or even a level of free trade. But would you, let's say you're President Econoboi, would you put restrictions into the ability of, let's say, China or Russia, Saudi Arabia? I don't trust Saudi Arabia as far as I could throw them. I don't like its government and how they treat its people, guest workers, women, non-Wahhabi Muslims, etc. How would you approach the national security concerns of governments like that from subverting our system through the economy? Is that a fair question?
I think yes and no. I mean, I think that overall that's really, I don't think, not necessarily a question for how you would organize production from a kind of general framework, right? So you could have a general framework of social ownership, which of course my practical model and my ideal model are both kind of, general frameworks of social ownership in an economy. But you could also have layered on top of that unique different industrial policies depending on the administration. You could certainly be a protectionist in my society just from a basic framework. Now, I would just generally recommend against that. I think that for me, the best way to counter these kind of, these other countries for the most part is through forming strong bonds and partnerships and trade flows with similarly aligned nations, right? So, for instance, one of the things that I think Trump is doing, which is extremely counterproductive, is engaging in a protectionist war with the European Union, right? It's like, no, I mean, to the greatest possible extent. I mean, like to the extent that Trump is telling the truth, like his just flat statement of I'm threatening these tariffs so we can de-tariff each other and just have a more free trade like flow of goods afterwards, that would be great. But Trump's not actually doing that. He's saying I'm going to do that, but then the agreements he's announcing are just higher tariffs than they were before, right? It's the opposite of what some people are saying. So, I think that's step one, is really to try and engage in as much of an internationalist effort as you can with like-minded nations, essentially just, Australia, Japan, broader Oceania, Europe, places like this, I guess South Africa, just like countries in general that have a history of aligning with, democratic values and things like that. So I think that's really where I would start. And then from there, I think that there's probably some pocketed issues of industrial policy that I would want to invest in personally, right? Like I think that it's probably good to have a lot of money that's poured into, say, like basic infrastructure. It's probably good to have a lot of money poured into climbing the value chain of certain things. So for instance, if we wanted to say, what are the kind of future industries that we think are going to be really important? Things like, I think like energy production and like transmission infrastructure, I guess AI, right? Stuff like that, chips manufacturing. That's pretty good. I think that was one of the things that Biden did that I think some libertarians had reason to be mad about, like, oh, well, it's just the government subsidizing another industry. To be fair, I don't think Biden did the industrial policy the way that I would exactly do it. But, something like that, I think, is a very sensible thing to do from both a value chain perspective, but then also from national security, that, hey, having things like chip manufacturing in your country is kind of like having arms production in your country. It's like just a very important thing to have some basic domestic capacity for. And so that's how I would kind of think about it. I really don't favor things like protection. Like, I don't think I favor things like tariffs specifically. Things like a VAT are good because they're trade neutrals. They don't actually trade. They don't change trade balances. But tariffs specifically are very bad. And I think that, in general, I would just favor other things, especially if we were to think about, like, for instance, a lot of people will say we need tariffs to protect certain industries. Oh, we need, like, they would say what I would say. They say, well, we need to tariff these chips because if we don't tariff them, we're never going to be able to get U.S. chip plants. And it's like, well, but if you think about, like, there's two ways to make U.S. chips competitive, right? One is to tariff foreign suppliers, and another one is to subsidize domestic ones. Either way, you're making domestic companies more competitive. The difference between the two is that a subsidy can be paid for with much more efficient forms of taxation. You could pay for a subsidy with, like, say, an income tax or a VAT, or, if we get there, a land value tax, these other, like, very efficient forms of taxation, which might actually be good for the economy, not bad. But a tariff is a bad tax to stop people from buying foreign goods, whereas it's much better for the consumer, and it's also much better for just the efficiency of our economy to do what you might call, like, positive industrial policy instead of this kind of negative disincentive of tariffs.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely understand your point on that. I would tariffs, I mean, of course, as you know from our economic history, help build our industrial base and whatnot. But the biggest problem I have with the Trump administration is the way he's handling our partners. I think of course, invading or wanting to invade Greenland and Canada, the 50, I mean, that's just, I don't want to sound ableist, so I'm not going to say the word, but it's the R word. It's not ridiculous, but it is. But it really is ridiculous because when you're basically locked in the continued Cold War, as I have argued, with Russia and China and their allies. You need to build a coalition. Now, of course, there are caveats with that, which we can go into at a different time, but there's a lot internally that we need to do. What good is tariffs when a lot of your publicly traded corporations operate on the mode that the bulk of their profits, it seems to be, are reinvested in stock buybacks? That's not being reinvested in new production facilities. This is billions and billions and billions of dollars that could be reinvested in industry. And what about also the lost talent that we have with the long dormant or industries that have disappeared? When you don't have industries within a country, you have your brain drain, or it just goes away. People are going into other professions and other jobs. And that's why I have my tuition-free education. This Trump will have none of that, even though he campaigned in 2015 and 2016 as a pragmatist and governed anything but a pragmatist or a pragmatic nationalist. That's, in my opinion, that's what needs to be done. Tariffs or VAT is just a tip of the tentacle of industrial policy. There's so much more, frankly, radical measures that radical by the standards of modern conservatism and neoliberalism, that needs to be done. There are some conservatives that understand it, like at Oren Cass and the American Compass and others, Sohrab Ahmari, but a portion of that community, from what I understand, or at least some of them, have gotten really discouraged behind the scenes with the way Trump is governing. But yeah, I had another point I wanted to make also. One of the things on my journey that I made from being sort of your traditional Reagan conservative, John Bircher, lots of libertarian tendencies, and now to where I am, a radical civic nationalist. And this is another thing that Kyle Kulinski, if you don't mind me mentioning and quoting different people, I hope you don't take exception to that, but he brought up a very good point. Years ago, he said that a number of so-called progressive policies actually are better at fulfilling conservative goals. Now, conservative goals, as I understand, as stated by Conservative Incorporated, and they're laudable in many ways in my eyes, are your strong families, your entrepreneurialism, strong national defense and everything else. But when you look at the record of their policies in action, the only thing they seem to want to conserve is the aggregated power and wealth of private sector oligarchs. This is the truth. I can give examples. Lindsey Graham and Congressman Collins from Staten Island in New York, during the first debate of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017, basically said, oh my God, our donors are totally tripping and all worried. If we don't get the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017 passed, all our wealthy donors are getting slaves. Screw you. We're not giving to the Republican Party anymore. You're done. We're done with you. And of course, they made it happen in 2017, just like they made it happen this year, unfortunately. So I think Kyle has a point. Do you think progressive policies, as a progressive, I still consider yourself a progressive, do you think actually progressive policies actually can fulfill conservative goals more effectively than supposed conservatism out there?
Yeah, I think absolutely that is right. I think it does depend on the kind of conservative for sure. I mean, I think, for instance, when I was on Tim Pool's show debating Connor actually about the welfare state, one of the things that I mentioned, and to be fair, this wasn't a sort of rhetorical trick to try and get the conservatives on my side. This was just something that I really believed in. But I was talking to my friend about it. I would oftentimes talk about welfare and its effects on the community, right? That, I think that it's a good thing to have community. Oh, 1 second. Never gotta kiss my wife goodbye. She's about to leave.
No problem. No problem at all. Take your time. Take your time. I'm gonna get a drink. I'm gonna get a drink break, a tea break here.
Yeah.
So I'll be right back.
Sorry, guys. My wife's going on a drive, and so she wanted me to give her a kissy before she left. All right, Nevin, you're back now.
I'm
Sorry.
back.
So, my wife interrupted my point. Damn it. No, she. No. So yeah, when I was on Tim Pool, I started talking about community and how, I think it's good for a number of reasons to have this kind of like egalitarian distribution of income, because I think that it increases our sense of community, right? And I'm using community to being like just like America at large through the state apparatus, right? That, I think there's a kind of like individual liberty and personal freedom and sense of community associated with like, hey, we all pay into these systems and we all take out of them when we need them. And that's kind of what welfare guarantees. But there's so many comments like this from Tim Pool's audience. There is a kind of conservative, kind of like a Dennis Prager type conservative, where they're almost anti-community, right? They're like hyper individualist. They're like, community, who gives a shit about that? I don't even care about your neighbors or anything like that. It's all about the family as an individual unit. It's like, okay, well, even if we were to speak just in those terms, right? I mean, things like child benefits and, college subsidies for kids and, public education, there's all kinds of ways that American policy from a left-tinted perspective helps individual family formation. I used to say that, the only real the only real anti-abortion party is the Democrats, because the Democrats are the only ones who actually, address the fundamental reasons why people get abortions, right? That, to the extent that you want to just say, look, I just hate abortion so much, I just think it should be illegal according to the law. It's like, okay, but that doesn't actually stop people getting abortions, right? And, if we look at like, why do people get abortions? A really large chunk of the reason why people get abortions is because they don't feel supported. They don't feel like they have a good sense of community. They don't feel like they have a financial stability to actually take care of the children. And the only way that you're actually addressing that is through, and it's not that the Republicans couldn't propose this, they just don't, is through family benefits and through, a broader welfare and public apparatus of support. And, I think that's certainly an argument. That's certainly an argument I think that you can make to a lot of conservatives to at least get them thinking about, really, what are you prioritizing here? Because again, I happen to think that, look, I don't think a lot of conservatives are like progressives in waiting like some people do, but I do think that because I think that they do prioritize those social issues just more than those economic issues. But at the very least, I think it can get them thinking, right? And I think that you're seeing like some of this kind of crack through a little bit, where it seems like there is a kind of like populist conservative that maybe represents, 5% of the actually existing Republican base, where they do actually think Medicaid is good. They do actually think that minimum wage should be increased. They do actually, like, I think even JD Vance said, you should raise the child tax credit to $5,000. And that's all pretend for the most part, right? Like, they didn't actually do that in Trump's tax bill, but it's like, okay, well, it seems like even to the extent that they have to message on it, it seems like some of that might be breaking through at least a little bit. But I'm not, not Cenk Uygur style, where I don't think that half the Republican Party is ready to vote for the next Democrat if we elect AOC. But it's like, I don't know, maybe there is like some room for bipartisan consensus on these, some of these narrow issues, if you could just propose a clean bill for them in the future.
Yeah, and very interesting points. And my part of my audience tends to be conservative, because obviously you just can Google my name. I'm very, favorable for a strong national defense, but not necessarily excessive hyper interventionism. And I don't like the defense contractor corruption. That's one area where I am open to nationalization of the defense industrial base. And actually, there's, for example, one of the factories that produces the M1 tanks in Lima, Ohio, is actually a state-owned enterprise, which I'm sure you're aware of that. So, but that's, again, different story. But with that stated, interacting with conservatives, I find it depends on their open-mindedness. It depends on how much they ensconce themselves in the bubble of Conservative Incorporated, which includes their media organs, and not listening or researching what the other side says and coming to a I don't want to say non-biased conclusion, but more of an objective conclusion. I think it depends on class status, although not exclusively. I find that from my own experience with the Coalition for a Prosperous America, trying to do outreach with the Tea Party years ago, as well as, meeting other wealthy people when I was an active Republican, with some exceptions. Many seem to be very disconnected from the notions of community. They tend to have pull yourself up by your bootstraps, say, if I can do it, everyone else can do it. Never mind the fact that the law of averages and personality types, not everybody can be an entrepreneur. You have to have worker bees, you have to have entrepreneur bees. That's no society solely has just totally entrepreneurs with no workers. And I come from a family of business people. My father, my stepmother, both sides of my family, very wealthy people. And it takes a special type of person to do that. It's not a bad thing, but your brain is wired differently than you being, let's say, a bookish intellectual or a librarian or a teacher, and stuff like that. I mean, that's what I find. But there are people that I've spoken about the issues, and I'm speaking to my audience and your audience. There are conservatives that get it. It's not the majority, but there always was this sort of, if you want to call it populist, pro-labor, old school Republicans. I mean, check this out. When I was doing research, and I didn't even know this, and this is, I inserted it in my essay, my last essay on my Substack, Wilderness of Mirrors. Did you know that Senator Robert Taft of Ohio was reconsidering his right to work legislation than Taft-Hartley? Ralph Nader pointed that out because he felt that he wanted to achieve balance between labor and capital, which I agree with. But he felt that his act that he co-sponsored with Congressman Fred Hartley pushed everything so far to the advantage of management that he's like, holy shit, I gotta water this shit down. So he actually was going to do that, at least, or was advocated for it. Or Barry Goldwater, for example. Barry Goldwater, while he was senator, voted for increases in the minimum wage. He was for protectionism for the copper industry in his native Arizona. And he was also for very radical campaign finance reform. He also later, in interviews, opposed President Carter's airline deregulation, at least partially because he saw the service quality decline, fare wars, compromised safety on the planes for passengers and staff. It's a lot of these different things. So I think also one of the reasons why I like to have these conversations is to kind of try and give the other side of what conservatism used to be, even with people that were considered very right-wing. I mean, Barry Goldwater was supportive of Nixon's creation of the EPA to some degree. I mean, I didn't even know this. You're not going to hear this shit on Sean Hannity or even the populist conservatives, so-called, which I think most of them are not honest, like a Laura Loomer and even Steve Bannon. And it breaks my heart to say it because I understand they want to protect their jobs, they want to protect their reputations, but where does also intellectual integrity come from? They know there are these problems, huge problems with the administration and backtracking and flagrant lying. And, this is why I do what I do, and I appreciate the opportunities that you and Connor and other streamers do, going on my show, going on panels, because this is a lost history. And, I don't mean to go on this rant, but I think this is important stuff. If you have any comments about what I said, I mean, feel free, but I got a couple of more questions. I hope you shoot some questions towards me. I want you to kind of pin me down, and stuff like that. But,
let's keep going.
What I have to say?
No. I think that's pretty sensible. I mean, I think that there is a very idiosyncratic history. It's hard to apply the current frame of American politics to the past because things, like you said, can start to look very confusing with how people were proposing certain things, and like what their party labels were at the time. And like you said, I mean, I think in part, again, I think there was a kind of Republican conservative movement for a time that did take it slightly more seriously, this idea about like this sort of conservative community ideal. But that's largely gone by the wayside over time. That's why I'm saying I think you can see some, in some sense, you can see that kind of sprouting out in some of at least the rhetoric of politicians. Now, it hasn't really been extended into policy at all. I mean, I think I'm trying to think like what was I don't know. I think maybe you can maybe argue that the biggest single thing that Trump did for everyday working people was the increase of the standard deduction, because it greatly simplified people's tax filing. But I mean, that's good, but it's like, I don't know, making your taxes easier to file. I don't know. Is that really that big of a deal? I mean, it's good, but it's like clearly just not actually, it's not really clearly our poverty rates are still substantially higher than they should be, right? So it's clearly not enough.
Yeah, I mean, the Gini coefficient probably, or Gini scores probably for a first world country. I don't know the score. Maybe you could tell us, but I'm sure it's pretty bad. It's probably like what, 0.40% or something. Who the hell knows? It's terrible. And really I mean, there needs to be, by the standards of conservatism incorporated, there needs to be radical surgery to the economy, and it has to be done in a careful way. You can't do it in a way that does a shock to the system. The first thing I would do is I agree with Senator Bernie Sanders on this. The first thing you need to do, almost by a vote of Congress, that's what would have to be achieved. I mean, I would love some Trump-like figure to do an executive order and basically do it Andrew Jackson and say, let the Supreme Court enforce it, and basically invalidate Buckley versus Vallejo, Bellotti versus First Bank of Boston, the concept from I think it was the Gilded Age, that corporations are people and they have the same rights as people, which predated the 1970s. Get rid of Citizens United, McCutcheon, because the problem is look, I have no problem with lobbying per se, or people redressing their grievances as called for in the Constitution. But when you start giving money to people, you start to expect things from them, especially in return. And they even will admit that. They even call it investments or investing in politicians, if I recall. They actually use that term, if I'm not mistaken. Correct me if I'm wrong, when the audience is here. That's basically corruption. And that's the first thing I would get rid of. I would wipe that out. Lifetime ban on lobbying for anybody working in any level of government, whether it's my level, whether it's the President of the United States, Senator, Defense Secretary, lifetime ban. That's it. Also, Americans cannot represent foreign governments and whatnot. So no money from foreign lobbies, I would consider them at least like U.S.-China Business Council, APAC, whatever. I mean, personally, if I ran for office, I would not speak to any of them, irrespective of my positions on Israel, Gaza. You don't want to be owned by a foreign country either, or a foreign corporation, or because your job is to represent the people of the United States. So, that's kind of my take. If you want to give your point on that, maybe a counterpoint if you like. But that's the first thing I would do. I would address the corruption. And Senator Sanders was right on point when he obsessively brings this up all over the place.
Yeah, I think money in politics is a really big deal. I think especially money in media is a big deal as well. That's kind of an understated thing. Like, I think that there's a sense that like, oh, it sucks that Elon Musk bought Twitter. And I think that's a general sense that people have, but there's not a lot of, I don't think, a lot of policy suggestions as to what to do to prevent that in the future. Right. That, if we think about, I mean, it just probably shouldn't be the case that you either have the ability to, or that people are so rich that they can literally start to buy entire news media organizations and just propagandize with them. You'd probably want that to be a more organic process. That was actually the very first Substack I released, was about how to kind of rethink news media and how we should kind of reorganize news media to try to fit more of the kind of public purpose that we think the news media should fit, which is informing people about the news, right? Not necessarily partisan propaganda on either side. So that's one thing. And then, yeah, I think that the money in politics is just a completely unacceptable thing for a number of reasons that, look, some people will point to studies that'll show like, oh, money in politics actually has a very marginal effect. And we can't, it's hard to really cleanly tie the effect of money in politics to these kind of truly wild, differences in basically what gets passed or not. And my point about that has always been, look, even if you think that money in politics has literally no actual effect, I think that it's still just, number one, at the very, very, very least, if it has no effect, it's a terrible use of resources, right? Like we should at least like limit it so that people spend money on things that are maybe a little bit more productive. And then and it's like, hey, okay, forget that for a second. I think also I think it represents in many senses a huge productivity suck and inequality with our politicians, because hey, you can say until you're wick in the face, or you can say until you're blue in the face. I'm sorry, you can say until you're blue in the face. Oh, it just doesn't actually matter. It doesn't actually matter. But the politicians don't think it doesn't matter, because when you talk to Congress people, they tell you, oh yeah, half my week is spent on the phone trying to convince donors to donate to either the party or to my campaign account. And look, if you ask me, I would imagine if politicians had to either spend half that time talking to everyday people to get them to donate to them, or if they had to spend half that time doing, productive legislating, it would probably just result in some better outcomes, right? You'd either get more experience, you'd either be able to communicate more with the people that represent you because they're spending more time actually reaching out to you, or they would spend more time doing, what you'd think to be their actual job, legislating and representing you and things like that. And many other countries have, for the most part, solved this problem. Like money in politics is a very particularly American problem when you look at the types of the amount of campaign spending that exists in other countries. It's not like America has twice as much campaign spending as other countries. It's like 20 times as much. It's some of the crazy order of magnitude more campaign spending. And it's just, that's bad for a number of intrinsic and, empirical reasons, I would say. So I think that was one of the things that inspired the Republican, the like conservative Bernie voter, right? I think that was like one of those issues where there, and again, I don't mean to overstate this. I'm not saying Bernie would have got 70% of the vote, but there was like 100,000 plus of these kind of conservatives who voted for Bernie because, he was the ringer in the pie. He was the one who was going to come in and actually stop all the corruption, and the money in politics thing was one of those, one of those issues that gave him some credibility in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, and kind of, I was one of those people, actually. I actually converted my registration to Democrat to vote for Bernie in the 2020 primary and gave money to his campaign, over $100. Probably shouldn't admit that, but it is what it is. Because, Bernie used to be very radical left. And I remember, I was born in 1974, so I vaguely remember him mayor of Burlington in the 1980s. He wasn't as super leftist when it came to local governance as people might want to believe. On foreign policy, he was way to the left than I am. But when he was in Congress, and you could say he did it because of political calculation, that's what kind of Chris Hedges, who was a Bernie ally, had claimed. He didn't want to become a Ralph Nader, could be genuine change of heart, where, Bernie, recognizes to a degree the threat of Russia and China. He had said in an interview in his last presidential campaign that he would intervene and protect Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan and stuff like that. So a lot of these things, I think, make independents and conservatives who look at the whole record maybe a little more comfortable with Bernie. Bernie actually is for capitalism to a large degree. I know that's like really shocking for people to hear, but when you listen and, read his statements, and it kind of describes my type of capitalism that I support, and Bernie has made speeches to this effect on a number of occasions. He said in 2009, capitalism does a number of things very well. It helps create an entrepreneurial spirit. It gets people motivated to come up with new ideas, and that's a good thing. But on the other hand, especially since the Reagan era, what we have seen in this country is an unfettered type of cowboy capitalism. And the result of that has been that the people on top have made out like bandits, and many of them are bandits. Today in America, we have a situation that's quickly moving out of control. He's 100% right. Now, I'm more of a reformist capitalist, or really a mixed economy person, really, I guess, by the definition you gave and Matt Britting made, but I guess I have socialist tendencies because I am for, even though the private delivery of medicine, but for a nationalized health insurance, because private insurance is predicated on the enhancement of shareholder value at the expense of patients. And health insurance executives have admitted that. And I talk about that in my essays on my Substack. I quote executives, the health insurance and pharmaceutical. I am open to potentially nationalizing certain defense production firms that just, instead of spending money on weapons, newer or more modern weapons, more their money on stock buybacks. And to me, I look at that as a problem. And you know, as I do, Econoboi, that there are both not only totalitarian nations that produce their weapons through state-owned enterprises, but also free countries that have large state-owned defense firms throughout the world that do produce high-quality weapons. So when I look at these issues, I'm, yeah, interesting, got to think about that. But with that, do you think capitalism, like take mid-20th century capitalism, why don't you go down that path? And maybe I missed something in your 3-part series, but why don't you stay still in that path, since it worked so well, still needed tweaking and tinkering? And maybe with the Bernie model of capitalism, which I think we all in some degree agree with, why don't you choose that? What was the black pilling event? Is just because you feel that capitalism, even mid-20th century capitalism, is just irredeemable, not workable, not practical? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, for the most part, I arrive at my socialism through very normative kind of esoteric arguments in some sense, right? Where like, I'll say that, look, I just take egalitarianism very seriously, and it's not clear to me that on a number of egalitarian axes, that capitalism is ever going to be superior to socialism in an ideal sense. And so part of that is because, to the extent that, like you said, okay, well, with these certain industries, right, like, the healthcare industry is based on shareholder value, and we think that that's bad for the delivery of service. It's like, at the very least, right, if we were to say, hey, something like a profit motive when you're delivering groceries isn't so bad, right, because it seems like it works really well, and it seems like shareholder value is like a perfectly fine thing to maximize when it comes to delivering people's groceries, like on the shelves. I mean, not like literally, delivery apps or anything. It's like, okay, well, fair enough. But then there's a question of what is the associated sort of distributed impact of the power of just owning those shares in the first place, right? That, to the extent that you would say, and I would say, that things like the wealthy and their influence in our political process is at least enabled greatly by things like money in politics and the regulations just simply basically explicitly allowing them to spend a lot of money. At the end of the day, there's a relational quality to great levels of wealth and income inequality in society, where a rich person doesn't necessarily relate to me as an equal, because they're going to live in their own neighborhood, and they're going to have their own house, and they're going to have their own institutions that they interact with, whether society kind of, flattens the edges of that with regards to how they interact in their political institutions or not. They're going to have more time to just spend on politics, right? I use the example in the first article that I referenced where, look, it is great. Like, it's a great improvement, I think, if politicians only were able to get individual contributions, but that's not the same thing as public funding, because when you look at even a person like AOC, about 80%, I don't know if it was 80%, but it was something, I think it was 60%. It was like 60% of her donations come from about 10% of people. It's like very unequally distributed. There's a lot of people, there's a lot of, high-income pharmacists, high-income doctors, dentists, lawyers, people like that who can write a max contribution, who can't necessarily, a lot of people who can't do that. Some people do just give $5 a month, and that's what these people really focus on. But the reason why the average donation is $30 a month or $30 in general is because there's so many people who are able to give $2,700, you know, whatever the max contribution is, right? And so that's not quite the same thing as pure horizontalization like public funding would be. And similarly, when it comes to the socialization of just like ownership in general, it's just not quite the same thing to say you can't spend your money on politics. We're going to have a high income tax and consumption tax and things like that. It's just not quite the same as just truly horizontalizing that ownership through the public ownership apparatuses that we have available to us. So I think that that's why I go further than just capitalism in my ideal sense. But I will say that again, that my practical model is one thing that I think I regret from, I think probably the only thing that I regret from the debate yesterday with Destiny was that I tried to make this point, but I couldn't stick the landing on it, that if we can at least agree that whatever, like the transitionary process of taking privately owned things and making them publicly owned, we can't call that transition socialism because it's not the socialist ideal. We can maybe just call it a socialist project. And it's like, okay, well, can we at least agree that you know, when we look at countries like Singapore, Norway, you know, many other countries that have other public institutions, like you mentioned the NHS, you know, places like this, that can we at least agree that the transition of many of the apparatuses of society from private ownership to public ownership, that at least that transition is something good to do, which is something that sounds like maybe you would agree with as well. It's just a matter of like, what exactly are the institutions that we're bringing into public ownership and what does that exactly look like? Because I think that's important. I think that that's something that many social democrats across the world have really made it a sticking point. They say, look, essentially we have socialist principles, and I would fall in that camp as well. But in terms of the platform that we're actually proposing, it's incrementalist in nature, right? We're going to take some things and socialize them. This is how we're going to do it. And I think that's a very, not only politically speaking, just a very sensible way to do things. It's also more efficient to do things that way. It's better for the economy at large. And I think that to the extent that I was talking to a socialist friend of mine, he said that, you know, in some senses, incrementalism is good because it allows you to be experimental, right? You know, you're not necessarily committed to socializing the whole of the economy overnight, you know, kind of like these other countries tried to do in various forms. And we saw that, you know, it turns out that if you have kind of a stubborn model in your head for what the economy should look like, and you try to say, oh, that's what the whole economy is going to look like in time zero, you know, you're probably going to get some things wrong, right? You just have to be a little bit humble about what, you know, you can really say we should implement in society on a practical level. And that's why you mentioned in my model, like the actual model that I propose that I would actually run on if I was running for office, still has things like private ownership and private capital investment. And, you know, like I said, I use the example of like, hey, if a guy just starts a really profitable company and just like really doesn't want to sell it, he could be a billionaire doing that, right? In my system, because I just do think there's probably these practical limitations that either our imagination or our actual capabilities just haven't expanded to the point that we could, you know, solve that level of inequality in such a holistic way on balance of our other values.
Yeah, no, you know, don't take offense to this, but I actually, and I do this with my own essays too as well, and don't get pissed at me, but I actually have put your essays in Grok. I've read through your essays. I looked at the points that jumped out at me. And, you know, I'm not saying Grok is an authority. The older versions of Grok would hallucinate, but it says on part 3, for example, it concludes, overall, this is a thoughtful, nonpartisan proposal, truth-seeking via evidence, not ideology. It could bridge left-right divides by preserving markets while advancing equality. You know, and I think that from what I've read, I think it's relatively a fair statement because I was looking for things that really kind of, that would be like red flags, no pun intended. And I just really, you know, I have to really mull a lot of points over, but there were things that I was looking for that, frankly, I'm like, whew, like you stand hard against the Marxist-Leninists very much. And they read that, they're probably going to get pissed at you if they haven't already.
Yeah.
I like
well, that's the thing, right? Like, I think that, you know, I think I think that is a very sensible approach, like your approach, right? Where it's like, you know, okay, like Econoboi calls himself a socialist. I'm a little bit skeptical, but, you know, like have an open mind, like really read the words that I'm saying. And, because again, if people want to say like, look, Econoboi, like I think to some extent, like Destiny in the debate yesterday, it seemed like he was kind of resolute in like, look, we just don't know if this would actually work. And I'm like, look, I mean, I agree. Again, I understand I'm arguing for a pretty radical transition, but we at least know that transition works, right? And if the worst thing that you can say about my model and kind of what I'm proposing is, look, I just have kind of a basic level of skepticism. Like, okay, I mean, that's fair for any probably political proposal, unless you just literally support that political proposal, obviously. But I mean, like even myself, like I'm very skeptical of the socialist ideal and like, could we actually socialize all the means of production without these kind of like very deleterious effects, right, on balance of your other values again? Because again, egalitarianism is only one of my values, but it's like I'm skeptical of like the holistic nature of how we could socialize it. And I think as well that this isn't a conversation that I've had with a lot of socialists because I guess my debating socialist days was like 2 or 3 years ago. And so and a lot of those socialists just frankly just don't do debates anymore. And I guess I'm also retiring. So it's like a number of reasons why I don't know that I'll have this conversation anytime soon. But I think there's kind of a very like dogmatic approach that a lot of just political thinkers take in general, right? And I think that's one reason why I push back on the characterization of my model so hard. It was in the debate yesterday. There was a guy named Jeb who I do like. He does irk me sometimes, but like there was a perfect combination of things that he did, and that debate was a little frustrating in a number of ways. But he had said something like, the reason why Singapore is the way that it is just because of its free market principles. And it's like, no, that's not true, right? Like that's what a libertarian would think Singapore is like. And I'm working on an article called like The Libertarian Fantasy of Singapore. Because
let me interrupt. Okay. There's a really good book by a libertarian who's originally from Singapore and was actually, I think, like exiled or fucked around with, Christopher Lingle. Years ago when I was reading an issue of Reason magazine in like the SUNY Albany library basement, because I'm still kind of a geek even today, and back then I was, even though I might not appear like one, and was reading an article. I think it was a book review of Christopher Lingle's book. I think it's called Singapore's Authoritarian Capitalism. There are libertarians that understand what Singapore is about, that it's not this laissez-faire paradise. Nothing, I mean, no. A lot of these East Asian tigers, no. Fuck no. No, no,
right.
No. Don't let me get into a history lesson. Go ahead.
But that's what I'm saying, though. I find that there's like a lot of dogmatism on the other side as well, where it's like essentially because no country has accomplished the socialist ideal, we're going to call every country capitalist, right? And it's like, well, no, but that's a very dogmatic way to view things as well. I think that was something that Brunig really kind of brought. That was one thing I call out in the first part of that article series you referenced was, I think that is just an extremely sensible way to view things, the Brunig framing. And he got it from a socialist that he read, and I can't remember the book that he referenced, but a socialist that he read made this point as well, that essentially, look, we have to think more so on the institutional level, that a lot of these countries are made up of capitalist and socialist institutions, privately owned production, publicly owned production, and then the public ownership can take various forms. Because I think that if you don't accept that framing, I think that it leads you, and obviously it's not just capitalist or socialist, you could be other things like distributist, Georgist, whatever, but that's just completely fallen out of favor. And so typically that's the paradigm people are kind of operating under. Unless you kind of accept that basic framing, then it leads you to make what I think to be like relatively ignorant statements about like, no, Norway is just a capitalist country. And it's like, I feel like if Norway was just a capitalist country, we wouldn't see, all of the collectively owned means of production in our society, right? Like it would be these, they would have a private oil company, not a public one. They would have private oil field services company, not public ones. They would have private schools, not public ones, right? They would have, instead of going out and having a decommodified fire service, police service, you'd have to buy an insurance product on the private market, right? I mean, and societies did have those things for a long time, but we decided that for various reasons, it just didn't work. And so we had to make these socially owned institutions. And again, if you wanted to say, I'm perfectly fine. Like I've had some very sophisticated criticisms of my model, which I think I'm decent enough at responding at. But to say that like on the semantic debate, like, oh, Econoboi is just arguing. I've heard people say that literally my model is just capitalism. It's like, dude, I don't think capitalism is when 75% of the businesses are owned collectively. Like you could say that that's in some regard a partially capitalist system, but that's just I don't know why it is. I guess it's I think it's probably just a holdover from the Cold War and like the Soviet Union, where it's like without saying it, it's like we think of socialism as basically like totalitarian, like command economies, when the reality is, you know, the histories of a lot of these public institutions is a history of committed socialists saying we want to do socialist advocacy by socializing these means of production. They just didn't have the kind of absolutist revolutionary fervor of these Marxist-Leninist experiments, which didn't work out. But for some reason now we've kind of like slowly boiled the frog into almost thinking of, I guess because of Cold War propaganda and stuff, it's like, even though a lot of those socialists were socialists that said they were socialists doing socialist things, we just don't really think of things like a state-owned oil company as socialist in nature, even though obviously we could have a privately owned oil company, you know, or like in America, we could raise enough tax money and just buy Exxon, and now it's a publicly owned company, right? But I don't know why, but for some reason that's just, it's very hard to get people to move into that frame of understanding, which I think is, to me, just I don't know. I read it and I was just like, oh, that's a very sensible way to think about things.
Some socialists that were in Western Europe, in the United States, Carl Gershman of I don't know if it still exists anymore, Social Democrats USA, Sidney Hook, and there were some others, strong socially democratic but relatively capitalist mixed economy types like George Meany and Lane Kirkland, who were the former presidents of the AFL-CIO. I mean, these were the staunchest of anti-communists. I mean, our CIA funded social democrats in Italy and France and West Germany during the Cold War, for example. Now,
yeah, like when I was reading about because I think one thing that made me, I don't know why I was particularly interested in this topic. I guess I was interested because it was just like it was like a supplemental piece of my research when I was kind of like really mulling over all these ideas, was like Attlee's government. I was like, you know, I wonder how Attlee handled, because he was a socialist, but he also, you know, participated in, you know, saw all this like kind of Red Scare stuff. And I was just like, generally speaking, like how did Attlee, did he take offense to that? Or like, how did he think about these things? And it just seems like, look, it just seems like in a lot of these countries, all of these socialist movements in these like Western democratic countries, they really didn't feel a lot of kinship with the Bolshevists and the Maoists, right? That, like, you know,
killed them in Russia. They fucking killed the Mensheviks. They suppressed sorry to interject, social revolutionaries. You know, so all those Jewish conspiracy type people out there, you know who tried to kill Lenin? It was a social revolutionary who was a Jewish lady, Fanya Kaplan. The first head of the Soviet brutal Bolshevik secret police head, Moses Uritsky. It was a Jew who tried to kill him, you know, in the early stages of the Bolshevik dictatorship. I don't mean to interject. You're right. And again, this is lost history. You know, while they were incorporating and killing Tsarist police officers, Okhrana, and people like, you know, General Brusilov and others from the Tsarist army, because they needed their skills and killed others brutally, they were brutally killing socialists, quote unquote socialists, that didn't agree with them, Mensheviks, as well as social revolutionaries and anarchists. Right. I know you take a hard view on anarchists in part 3 of your essay. You don't think it's practical because of the poverty, and I think there were some other reasons you put, but still they're part of the left.
Yeah. Well, that's what I'm saying, is that I just don't think that, and when you read a lot of the writing, it wasn't quite a pamphlet. Back then it feels like 1950s pamphlets were just books, but Attlee had written a kind of a pamphlet or a book where he essentially described this. I think it was maybe in the 70s when he wrote it. It was after his time in office, if I'm not mistaken. But where he talked about this, and he said, look, you know, at the end of the day, like the big distinguishing factor, and it's a very meaningfully large difference, of course, between you know, USSR, Russian socialism at the time, and British socialism, is that British socialists, generally speaking, believed in democracy, right? And I think that was one argument that I had with this week with like Ryan Mullally, where he has this view that essentially when you give the state power, it's like this ultimately potentially tyrannical thing. And it's like, look, I mean, I just really don't think so, right? That I think that when I think of the tyranny of the USSR, I don't really think of their state-owned factories, right? I don't think that's where most people's minds go to when they say, oh, the tyrannical part about the USSR was the fact that they had state-owned factories. No, it was the fact that they had a brutal police state and no individual liberties, and they had no democracy at all, and people couldn't vote, and you couldn't express yourself in their societies, right? And I think the reason why people don't think about that is because we see government-owned factories in all these other places that are democratic, and they're state-owned industries, and you could say they're inefficient. You could say that they're not like the best way to organize production, and you're more of a capitalist, sure, but to say like it's tyranny when we have a government-owned enterprise, like no, of course not. It's tyranny when we don't have democracy and individual liberties, right? And that's what Attlee said, 75 years ago or something like that. And again, I think that's a very sensible way to kind of understand, I think, a very meaningfully large difference. It's like saying, I'm a liberal who doesn't believe in ending slavery. It's like, okay, I mean, a liberal who believes in ending slavery and a liberal who believes in slavery, like, it's like you could say that foundational thinkers like the founding fathers were liberals, and a lot of people do call them like, oh, these were the classical liberals, they were liberals. But to the extent that the founding fathers were in the liberal canon, comparing those people to people like John Rawls, it really is night and day. They had a very different way of viewing things, right? Even though you could call, in some sense, the broadest tent, both of them liberals, right? And socialism is no different.
Yeah, but one thing I do about the state factories, and you're right, there are mixed economies that do have state-owned factories that don't suppress political liberty, but there is also an issue with the Soviet Union. And really, this is, as I know you've read the Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. I had to read it in the freshman year in college in Political Science 101, Professor Livingston, great guy. And I read at the end where they had the listing of the program of the Communist League in Germany, authored by Marx, basically, in his manifesto. And even in his manifesto, he calls for authoritarian measures like despotic inroads against private property and whatnot. And I think when you forcibly, which you don't advocate, you are so clear in there. I don't know how people get it confused. I don't get it, but whatever. Here he's talking about the forceful destruction of private property. And really the seeds of Bolshevism is in the Communist Manifesto. And when you look at industrial armies, he calls for, I mean, yeah, there are things I agree with, vaguely public education, but the question is what would public education look in Marx's world versus your world or my world on the other end of the spectrum, which is far more liberal, or either supportive of private enterprise like me, or at least tolerant and open to continued private ownership, although not being the dominant source in the economy. So I think there is a case to be said. Yes, the state factories might not be necessarily an automatic hallmark of tyranny, but how did those factories and farms became state-owned or state-controlled, for example? And that's the difference. And it brings me to another point you mentioned earlier about state power. And look, I have a lot of skepticism to some degree of state power. I think in some ways in your essay, your three-part series, I might be misreading your intentions, but you have a very cautious side. You seem like you're trying to preempt, particularly in the third part, every concern that you had and continue to have and other people have about state ownership. And you give arguments, about the workers, about the investors. Is private ownership going to be abolished? Can capitalist-oriented parties still run? And you say yes, 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 and yes, basically, and you give your justifications as to why. But you have to look at and I say this to both of our audiences, you have to look at the intentions of the political party, the ruling group. You have to look at the programs. You have to look at the history. And this is my problem with this whole Hayek's road to serfdom. Social democracy does not necessarily end up to totalitarianism. Let's take the case of National Socialist Germany, the Weimar Republic. Richard Blythe, who's a professor in the University of Rhode Island, I really recommend you get his book. You probably have read it, and many in your audience, Austerity. And he talks about how austerity and this sort of neoliberal austerity in Weimar Germany, in Japan, in the late 1920s and into the beginning of the 1930s resulted in massive economic dislocation and enhanced anti-capitalism. Yeah, Weimar Germany, yes, it had state-owned industries and whatnot, but because of political disorder and a lack of responsiveness of those previous governments to really solve the problems of depression, these were both conservative as well as social democratic governments in Germany, and in Japan, they were classically somewhat liberal until the early 1930s when Japan moved in an extremely state-controlled form of fascist command economy. This road to serfdom, I think, frankly, and I'm going to piss off the libertarians when I say this, but it's nonsense. It's because of political changes, political shifts, and a lack of responsiveness of the old governments to deal with severe problems they had that brought the serfdom to begin with. And there are many examples. There's a blogger by the name of Lord Keynes on the internet. You could look up his blog. You might be familiar with him. And he talked about how in Austria, how tried aspects of austerity and massive cutbacks in the 1930s. And the economic indicators, yes, it was good for growth and other indicators, but when it came to poverty, falling wages, and whatnot, there were a lot of problems. And this was despite the fact that Schuschnigg and Dollfuss were very critical of liberal capitalism as well as communism, and they were for a corporatist statist system. But they also brought in Ludwig von Mises, who I agree with on basic issues, but a lot of other issues I don't agree with, and I take exceptions with some of his contempt for the working class and the middle class. But a lot of the policies that were recommended, as Lord Keynes documented with footnotes, led to people embracing the National Socialists in Germany, who were very, from my point of view, very radically anti-capitalist. They brought them in. They were promising an end to unemployment. They were promising everything, and reforming capitalism, really controlling capitalism and abolishing it as they understood it, and everything else. So this notion, I really take exception to this notion that social democracy leads to totalitarianism. It's actually trickle-down economics, neoliberalism, unaccountable globalization, union busting that is the road to serfdom. I'm actually going to announce this on air. I eventually am going to work on an essay. It's a short story, and it's a twist of 1984, Red Dawn, and also movies 2073 that recently came out. I really recommend it, as well as Incorporated. The latter two deal with this sort of dystopian Curtis Yarvin sort of big business plutocratic authoritarian dictatorship in the United States. And what I'm going to argue essentially in my novel, so I guess I'll have to publish it under my name now, is basically Trump wins and validates the 2026 and 2028 elections. You have the economic depression, unlike what we've seen since at least the Great Depression. You're going to have Russia and China take advantage of the discords. You're going to have Trump and his supporters shooting at both violent demonstrators as well as peaceful demonstrators on the immigration issues, on the economy and whatnot. And you're going to have a group of different disparate tanky groups and certain neo-fascists coalesce together into an organization called Amerisoc. And they're eventually going to take power because American military units, after they're asked to fire on crowds, and a lot of this is also based on history, and you could pick my mind and I can defend it. They're going to defect to Amerisoc. People are really alienated and disenchanted, and they're going to eventually with Russian and Chinese help, they're going to sense opportunities that the United States is falling apart. Our allies are kind of half-hearted in supporting the United States as it falls because they're kind of pissed with Trump and the Republicans with their policies. So they're going to kind of like half-heartedly support us. And basically what's going to happen, to make a very long story short, Marisak will take over and will launch a horrific dictatorship. And you'll have elements of the MAGA community as well as progressives who aren't killed off. People like you would be clearly killed off. People like me, definitely. They would eventually form a horrible dictatorship, Marisak, that is so horrific that makes the Trump GOP look like amateurs. And you'll have exiles abroad, Americans fleeing for their lives, basically saying, you know what, we fucked up. And you're going to have progressives and people like me coming together to form the reflective republic, essentially, and form a new government, which will create a sort of capitalist economy, but a lot of mixed economy features and a lot of the reforms that I think we advocate and whatnot. And I think sometimes the best way to tell a story is in fiction. And it kind of gives you a bird's eye view, for those of you who are not familiar with my work, of what my views are. You know, and in some ways we have this in common. You and I are very syncretic politically. And, you know, people think, oh my God, you probably have a chat people saying this guy is a batshit crazy anti-communist. He lives in the Cold War and now he pivots all the way over to this sort of progressive form of capitalism. Like, what the hell is this? But, you know, this is the conclusions I've come to based on my research, people I talk to, people I interact with, the library, diverse groups of people and everything. And that's pretty much the story. So if you have any reactions to what I said or any questions, I still got like one or two more questions, then you can like pick my mind. But now you made me tell the world about my short story that I eventually will get to.
Yeah, no questions at all. I mean, that all sounds pretty interesting, and you know, good luck. You know, it's a hard thing to do to write a book as a librarian. I'm sure you're sympathetic to the struggle. But good luck with that. That sounds really interesting.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Now, one of the bunch of things I did agree with Connor and Wick on, and you kind of validated to some degree their points. You didn't like say it was crazy or this is, you know, nonsense. This notion of the Democratic Party, as I said in the chat with you online through Discord, my view on the Democrats is you have this sort of progressive populists that are not really fully against capitalism, like Bernie Sanders. They accept capitalism. Elizabeth Warren, who's quoted as saying, I'm a capitalist to my bones. She has a very interesting story of how she got to where she was politically. It's a very interesting story. Then you have the Reaganite light types like Bill Clinton, the Clinton types that will work with the Republicans to get all these free trade agreements, to support various deregulations. By the way, you referenced about the monopolization of media. There is a solution for that. You bring back the Fairness Doctrine and you repeal the Telecommunications Act of 1997. There were Reagan and Clinton era deregulations that allowed the consolidation of newspapers as well, print media, as well as electronic media. I would immediately get rid of that. And I would start some major antitrust actions in the early part of my administration if I was governing the United States. So you have that wing, which are the Reaganite lights, I call them. Then you also have a portion that are hard left of varying degrees. There is evidence that the Communist Party USA and the DSA have conscious plans to infiltrate the Democrats. The Communist Party would run candidates even into the 1980s openly, but they also, as their own literature would state, they want something, you know, they would call it the Popular Front or the All People's Front, where they would infiltrate, as they said in Gus Hall, and I interlibrary loaned the book called The Lame Duck in Turbulent Waters, written in 1972, where he said one of the operating legs was of the Communist Party USA was the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. And they wouldn't announce themselves, of course, because most liberals, especially at that time, were strongly anti-communist. One of my political heroes was a guy by the name of Senator Scoop Jackson from Washington State. And, you know, very pro-labor, very progressive in many ways, but very very much in favor of strong national defense and anti-totalitarian. His anti-totalitarianism was really forged what he saw as a World War II soldier at Buchenwald in the concentration camps and the horror show that was there. So they had to infiltrate themselves, just like conservatives. And I talk about it in my last essay on Substack on remaking the right. The conservatives, like the right to work people, the Lee Atwater strategy, and others, it's like, hey, let's deflect, let's cover up who we really are. Let's say that the DeMille Foundation, for example, way back when they were promoting right to work, they were saying, let's just mask ourselves because our message wouldn't appeal to ordinary people. So we have to call it freedom and whatnot. And the Communist Party USA will do that. Sometimes neo-fascists like David Duke did that by portraying himself decades ago, I remember, as this Joe Blow conservative. Why? Because their agendas are all shit. Whether you want to bust unions and trickle-down economics, Marxism, Leninism, or neo-fascism. So people who are smart will do that. DSA, I think it was Maria Smart who said that they'll have, I think, 1 foot inside the Democratic Party and 1 foot out. She talks about, DSA talks about how in their state of Texas, I think, that they had this kind of dual strategy. And, again, so they try to do it. I think they have a lot more influence than their relative to their size. I know there are obviously issues and sectarianism within DSA. It's become much more radical left. I mean, DSA itself was born from a split in the old Socialist Party in the USA in the 1970s and 1980s. And that was based on anti-communism and relations with Cuba, the Soviet Union, and Vietnam War. The Socialist Party supported the Vietnam War, at least a negotiated settlement that at least preserved independence for South Vietnam. And then the Michael Harrington's wing of the Socialist Party, he left and formed DSOC by about the early 1980s, which then eventually became the DSA. As you know, you probably know this. I'm sure many in your audience know this. Other people don't, may not. And DSA has continuously sailed to the left. They're hostile to all private ownership, at least I think my reading of the program. And I have concerns about them. Like on the World Socialist website, they ran an article, no right-wing website. And they ran an article where the DSA, or many of their chapter leaders, the Young Socialist DSA or whatever, I forget the name of their youth group, and chapter leaders, a whole bunch of them, I mean a lot, were all liking and celebrating the assassination of Leon Trotsky, who's a guy that I don't agree with. He's just a totalitarian with a different flavor somewhat. But they celebrated the assassination by Stalin's by the Soviet NKVD in Mexico with a fucking ice pick put to his head. So there's a lot of concerns I have about that. And look, I don't think you fit in that milieu. I think if they got to you, they probably would put 2 ice picks in your head because you're too bourgeois and too timid, probably. That's what, that's what they would probably feel about you. So I think there's a lot. I think Connor and Wick, I think, were more correct. I mean, are they on the verge of taking over this country right now? No, obviously not. Are they taking over the leadership of the Democratic Party right now? Absolutely not. Where I do think eventually they will grow in size, and they are, by their own newspaper and websites suggest, and I believe it, is through a lot of the policies that are being pursued right now, where people are getting pissed off with capitalism as it's currently configured. And that's where I see them growing. And I don't think look, if there's an economic depression, I think the way the second Trump administration is acting right now, I don't think they care. I think they're delusional. I voted and supported Trump vocally in 2015 and 2016. I explain why in my writings. I abandoned him. Look, I'll recognize in his first administration some of the many of the good things he did, but as well as the horrible things he did. And in this second administration, I think he has agency. He makes his own decision. He's a grown man. He is surrounded by really some of the worst people imaginable. And I just don't think he's going to handle a national crisis well. Look at COVID. And people have argued, not unreasonably, that COVID was a Chinese biological weapon. And I talk about that, and there are Chinese officials on Twitter, generals, etc. European press has reported that. And when you're dealing with a fucking national crisis, you got to unify your country. You got to take care of your business people in an accountable way. You got to take care of your people that are unemployed. I know people were almost made homeless because they were kicked out of their homes. An ex-girlfriend of mine was, and she lived with me. You know, we were living separately at the time. That's real world shit. And extremist groups, Communist Party USA, DSA, ESL, for their sizes, they were growing off the fucking charts more than personally than they should have. You look at what's her name, Gloria La Riva, under Trump, said she is the head of the PSL, ex-Workers' World Party, longtime veteran of those causes. She said that the fog of communism are lifting on the younger people. Now, I think the Cold War never ended. People might say I'm crazy. Read my essays, make your decisions from that. But that's where I see the problem really coming from. And I am I've had discussions with people, Connor, they understand what I'm saying, and others, but a lot of people don't understand that. You don't want extremism and anti-capitalism. You need to improve the fucking system fast. There are some rich people recognizing that. Peter Thiel, ironically, on Twitter, there was an email that was leaked of his, which actually talked about a lot of what I'm saying. Whether he does something or not, I don't know. And many others have talked about it, but not enough. And it scares the shit out of me. Call me alarmist or whatever. But, I'll close on this point. You'll respond if you'd like. In Russia, you had the provisional government, which was democratic. You had Tsar Nicholas II. They continued the war on the Allies, even though the Russian army was performing miserably with defections and people going home and leaving the front lines. And Lenin, in a country of 91 million, had 200,000 Bolsheviks members in 1917. And they were spreading flyers, as you know, many of you know this, are very passionate about this. You know what those flyers said? Peace, land, and bread. That's what they were offering. That's what the people needed. Provisional government was not giving that because they were very kind of disorganized. They had a full plate dealing with a country that was a mess. And Tsar Nicholas II, in my opinion, was possessed with a hubris and mass corruption, just like the current administration. Mark my words, we get into a war and economic depression. Look, America is a very resilient and resourceful country. There are a lot of good patriots. I consider you a patriot, obviously with flags behind you. I'm a strong patriot. Many of the people in the spaces are. Connor has put his life on the line, both police and military. Wick, I think he was in the military from what I understand, and others. But this deeply upsets me. I am very concerned. And I know it's intense.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think on the DSA point specifically, I mean, I guess I agree and disagree. Like, I think that DSA, one thing that's caused, I think the DSA to both succeed and to suffer, I would say, is that they're not a platform organization. So they do have a platform, but it's not an organization where you have to actually adhere to the platform of the organization. And so you see like a really, really huge degree of factionalism in the DSA. It's a very, very broad tent of socialists, like you said. So there's your what you might call your right-wing socialists, like me, who are basically, super committed Democrats, believe in reform, believe in incrementalism, and then there's your Marxist-Leninists as well within the same tent. And I would argue that. I would argue that basically the DSA probably should become a more structured platform organization that, the DSA probably should have in its charter that, they're committed to, they do have this, but like they're committed to democracy, they're committed to reform. They reject, similar to how like you see in, I think I was looking at an Australian Labor Party manifesto from 1929, where they explicitly say essentially, we reject Bolshevism, we're not Bolshevists. And I think similar today, you would say like, we're not Marxist-Leninists, basically, which I think would be probably valuable to me, because I don't know that, number one, Marxist-Leninists are actually a huge proportion of the membership of DSA. But like you said, I think they do scare a lot of people off with kind of their general disposition. And I guess as well, they're so ideologically misaligned from myself that I don't really, like, I just don't know that I would be part of like the same group as like Marxist-Leninists, right? And because of that factionalism as well, the different branches of the DSA are also all over the place, right? Some branches are much more kind of tinted Marxist-Leninists, whereas some branches are much more kind of social democratic in terms of how they organize, much more kind of collaborative, right? And so I think it really, it kind of just depends, right? Like if I was a politician, I feel like because of what you said, like I don't know if the DSA would be worth kind of like really interacting with that much. I mean, I think I would, but it also depends literally on where you live, because your chapter might not let you in the room because you call yourself a Democrat, right? So I mean, some chapters are just very different. But I don't think that, at least from what I see, right? Like I don't really think there's a lot of worry about Marxist-Leninism or something like that becoming like a mainstay caucus in Democratic Party circles. And I think that the best piece of evidence for this is just who are the actually existing socialists that get elected to state level, local level, federal level positions. And you look at that class of people, it is just like, there's no Marxist-Leninists, right? Now, some people might say, like you said, well, some of these people might be essentially hiding their power level. These might be people that believe in kind of infiltration. But I don't know. I mean, like, I just don't really, when I talk to Marxist-Leninists, like the overwhelming portion of them will be very open about the fact that they don't want to work in Democratic Party frameworks, right? Like they don't like the Democratic Party. They don't want to be collaborative with Democrats. They think people like Mamdani are sellouts, right? Like, and that's their right to have that opinion. Obviously, I just disagree, but I just find that the American Marxist-Leninist movement, number one, is very, very small, and number two, is really quite open with all of their tactics that they take, and for the most part, running as Democrats is just really not one of them. Like for instance, a lot of the all the candidates you mentioned that have actually done that were Republicans, right? Republicans who've done that. You talked about David Duke, right? Well, he was a Republican, right? I agree that there's a lot of, there probably are a lot of like politicians who are deeply racist who hide those views, but I just don't really think there's a lot of politicians that are deeply Marxist-Leninists that hide their views and run in Democratic circles. I think for the most part, like a guy like Mamdani, who, I think Mamdani could rightly be framed as maybe the furthest left elected Democrat, right? I know he hasn't technically won his election yet, but he's probably the farthest left elected Democrat that we could probably think of. Literally, not like AOC or Bernie Sanders, has had rhetoric in the past of like, no, we want to seize the means of production, markets are evil, this kind of thing. But even a guy like that is seemingly very committed to democratic frameworks, very committed to kind of rule of law, individual rights, things like that. So I don't know. I mean, even the potentially like worst example, Mamdani in this case, which I'm not as offended by Mamdani as most people are, but even like the furthest left example that we can conceive of, it's just really not clear to me that these guys are like Marxist-Leninists. There's not a lot of examples of this in general. I mean, I think we could even look at look at like Cory Bush or like Jamal Bowman, a couple of I believe DSA endorsed Democrats who lost their primaries and became more critical of the Democratic Party afterwards. To the extent that they became more critical, it's not clear to me that they're actually Marxist-Leninists, right? They're just people who are now a little bit less bound by the party apparatus, so they can essentially say "fuck you," but they're not necessarily saying, I'm a Marxist-Leninist.
Yeah, no, and you make fair points in that respect. They don't announce themselves. Most of the Marxist-Leninist organizations you're right, like the Workers' World Party, the PSL, that I'm aware of, unless there are certain theoretical texts and articles that they pen that state otherwise, particularly PSL, but they refuse to work with the Democratic Party. They tend to be very nasty to the Democratic Party. Michaela Maupin refers to Bernie Sanders, for example, in an article years ago as a, quote, sewer socialist, which is not his coinage, and it's kind of an accurate statement. If you think about that, other than the likes of Bernie Sanders, there's a lot of contempt. They feel they're imperialists. They feel that they're really capitalist reformists, and a lot worse, actually, and warmongers and everything else. Very true. But with the CPUSA and CPUSA defectors, and unfortunately, it's just the conservative press like American Thinker have reported this. There was, as well as also DSA, which is very radical left compared to somebody like an Elizabeth Warren, who's mistakenly identified as a socialist, and she clearly is not, in my opinion. And the DSA and the CPUSA do, and the CPUSA, of course, is Marxist-Leninist, although these days they call themselves, quote, Bill of Rights Socialism. Periodically, the CPUSA will reinvent themselves to try and make it more palatable to the American public. They used to have a slogan, communism is 20th century Americanism, they used to say it in the 1930s. But you're right, but the other groups, they do have those penetrations. We don't know who all those people are. My friend Kenny, that I referenced, he had told me that down in Florida, the PCUSA, well, there was someone in one of the local water boards in one of the counties in the Tampa, St. Petersburg area, I believe. I forget which county it was he mentioned. And he said it was a secret PCUSA member. And a small group like that, inserting people in politics, that's, it is concerning, and it's something that needs to be watched, especially when you get popular alienation and everything. But this is also, on the other hand, where I might be giving this, quote, Red Scare propaganda, but you also have to temper it with another side of the issue. Not every fucking progressive is a communist. When you look at the real record, I'll give you an example of where the other side, we have to be careful. You're familiar with the publication, The New American magazine's publication of the John Birch Society. And they had an article by Warren Mass, which analyzed one of Elizabeth Warren's foreign policy speeches. And it was an excellent speech she gave. Strong on national security, strong on the threat of Russia and China, strong on concerns of rising anti-capitalism resulting from the plutocracy and the neoliberalism and the out-of-control economic inequality. And she talked about that, and she talked about how we need, which I happen to agree with, a whole of government strategy to confront this continued Cold War, if you want to call it. It's 100% correct. So what did the Birchers do? So Warren Mass wrote an article, I think willfully misinterpreting Elizabeth Warren as basically saying, see, Elizabeth Warren says China has a whole of government strategy and we should have one too. Well, when you read the fucking speech, she says that we need to have a whole of government strategy to confront China, to confront Russia, and these are basically bad governments and adversaries of the US, she basically says. So I think, there's, your point is, counterpoint is well taken. I do agree with the penetrations of the party. The evidence is clear. I could send it to you privately or whatever. Some of my notes for eventual upcoming essay. A lot of my essays tend to be very long and large and dense. But the other side is there's a lot of misinterpretation. And if you want to use this, there's a really good statement. James Burnham, who wrote for National Review, I think he was one of the editors. He was a former Trotskyite communist. And he wrote in a book, I think you'll appreciate this quote, Econoboi, called The Coming Defeat of Communism, published in 1950. He said, very many businessmen, meaning very conservative businessmen, because he was part of that milieu, very many businessmen do not know the difference between a communist and an anarchist, democratic socialist, or mere eccentric dissident. They pick up a pompous phrase like socialism is the halfway house to communism and imagine that by repeating it if they are being profoundly philosophical. And there are others that have mentioned that too as well, who are more, quote, socialist or social democratic in the American scene, like Carl Gersman, Sidney Hook and others, that are just as staunchly anti-communist as you, or anti-Marxist-Leninist, if you want to say, like you and I. So I think the point's definitely well made. Did you have any questions for me? Because I think we've exhausted quite a few topics about your interviews. I mean, I did watch part of the Destiny debate, and it was interesting. I didn't listen to the whole thing, but I got the impression, I guess the argumentation to you was more on economic theory. It kind of reminded me of the economic classes that I took. It was all theories and suppositions and what if this and this and that. And there's really, I mean, again, Destiny's a very bright guy. He's an excellent communicator. He's successful, and God bless. But his arguments don't resonate me. I come from more the historical school, and I think a lot of other people do as well. What works in history? What actually happened? What is the history behind the policies? How did it work in the real world? One of my favorite conservative commentators, Anthony Horrigan, who used to write for the Spartanburg Journal Herald, he had an address to economists, an article in 1984, and he talked about how the economists have to act like journalists. They actually have to go to the freaking factories and the shops and the stores and the farms and actually talk to people and learn actually everyday things on what happens in a business, what happens in a labor union and everything else, rather than all these theories about supply and demand and everything else. Those are good starting points, but those speak of ideal types. You have to deal with the meat and potatoes. So if you have any questions for me, shoot.
No questions. I was just going to respond. There was an interesting point. I was talking to a socialist friend of mine where I was like, man, I do feel like, this was actually before the debate I had with Destiny, but it's like, I do feel like people really misunderstand capitalism in a lot of regards. And this was, in some sense, this was evident in the debate I had with Destiny, where some people were saying, like, I think even Destiny had alluded to this, like, oh, like Econoboi system is like so much more bureaucratic than our current system. And it's like, no, it's not. That's not true at all. I think that to some degree you could say that there's literally like one extra bureaucratic step, right? Which would be that there's a committee that determines basically when to start new holding corporations, right? But that's it, right? Like, I mean, because when I talk about, like, you have to come up with how you appoint board members, and then the board members have to come to these decisions, and then the board members have to ultimately appoint management, and then the management has to hire the workers, and then you have to determine your pay scales, and then you have to determine your dividend policy. Like, people are hearing me say that, and they're saying, like, oh my God, that sounds like a crazy bureaucratic thing. It's like, that's how, like, Destiny got frustrated by me saying this, like, it's just like how currently it works, because I think there's like an understanding of like, oh, these systems are like so much more efficient. They're so much more like streamlined. And it's like, no, like, running a corporation is a very bureaucratic thing, right? It's a very bureaucratic process. It's a very, just like, look at how they're structured, right? Like, shareholders have to decide on who to appoint for the boards, and the boards have to decide on management. And there's like turnover for all these positions all the time, and they have to change their policies, and the economy changes, and there's such a dynamic process. And so it's I do think there's like this problem where I think people have, in some sense, I think they have a kind of a misunderstanding. I guess, like, I like to think of myself as kind of like, in many regards, bridging that divide, because I studied both economics and finance and worked in private industry. So I feel like I've got at least a better kind of like touching grass kind of economics perspective, where it's not quite so pie in the sky. I think as well, that's one of the reasons why this book, The Public Wealth of Nations, I think resonated with me so much, was because it was an investment banker who is not a socialist, just to be clear, an investment banker. Or at least I don't know that he's ever said he's a socialist, but he worked for the Social Democrats at one point in his life. But it's an investment banker who took a very kind of almost like accounting perspective on how to manage public wealth. And it's like, man, this is very, very practical. This is a guy that literally his whole job was how to make public assets run efficiently, right? And he's not necessarily recommending, the whole of the economy should be publicly owned or anything like that. But, he is a person who knows how these corporations work and run, and understands, I guess, like, how to make them run at the very least better than they otherwise would be. And so I agree with you in part that there are a lot of economists out there who definitely, I think, struggle with the actually existing economy of the world, right? And they're a little bit too stuck in, they're a little bit too stuck in the sky, I think. It's similar to, I've had this experience. I think many people have had a similar experience where if you start to take advanced mathematics or advanced economics in grad school or something like that, you'll find that you've kind of forgotten your fundamentals at a certain point, right? I recall an instance when I was in grad school, which was really funny, where the problem on the board that we were kind of working on as a group was basically how to take the area of a triangle, right? That was like the fundamental like problem that we were facing. And you had it was like me, a political science guy who did economics undergrad as well. You had a computer scientist, a math major. We were all not necessarily sure how to take the area of this triangle because it was like it was a triangle where it wasn't a right angle triangle, right? It was like an isosceles triangle. It's like, how do you take the area of an isosceles triangle? It's like, dude, your average third grader could tell you how to do that. We've been spending so much time doing this advanced mathematics and calculus and shit that we've kind of forgotten our fundamentals. And I recall a professor who I spoke to a long time ago, actually, who said that he would teach a graduate level micro course. And he said that for extra credit, he would allow his students to take his undergraduate micro course. And he said, if you could get it, whatever, it's like, if you could get at least a 95% on this test, I'll add some points to your grade. But he said that a lot of graduate students in economics can't pass an undergraduate micro test because you just eventually lose all those fundamentals. Last example I'll give is I have a friend who's doing a doctorate degree in marine biology. Her undergrad was in biology as well. And there was like a meme or like a graphic that was going around of like, if you can't do this, you have no business calling yourself a biologist or something like that. And it was just like a simple, like 10 question, like almost like elementary school biology test. Right. And my friend kind of pointed out, she's like, look, I probably couldn't get most of these right. Right. But I'm literally doing a doctorate degree in marine biology. Like eventually it's not just that you're like in the sky thinking, your knowledge also gets highly specialized. Somebody who has an MBA, but who works his entire career doing investment banking, just like doesn't know the type of things who someone who has an MBA who spent his entire career working in public finance, right? They're just like a completely different ships in the night type level of knowledge that they would have. And so anyway, that's a big supplement to what you said, but I think I agree in large part. And it's been great talking with you, Nevin. I don't think there's you said I guess you've exhausted your list. It's getting pretty late for me as well. And thank you for the well wishes on my internet retirement. I wish it was a real retirement so I didn't have to work anymore. Maybe, hopefully one day. But anything else you wanted to talk about before we hang up?
Yeah. Well, let's plug in where we can find our works to,
Sure,
both our audiences. I really appreciate the time. I hope we could stay in touch offline. I'll send you additional contact information if you're interested either way. No, I wish you a lot of luck. It is a kind of a shame you have to retire, but I mean, you have to tend to family needs and family comes first, and being a good husband and, whatnot. You have a lot on your plate, I'm sure. Where can people, before I go on about where people can find my work, where can people find your Substack, your YouTube and everything else?
Yeah, to the extent that I'm active making content at all under the Econoboi label, it'll be on Substack. So econoboi.substack.com. That's the URL. And I write about pretty much all kinds of things. I do write about politics as well. But I've had a recent stint mostly talking about socialism, obviously. But, I plan to continue to write about a diverse range of different economic things. So if people are interested in that, they can go to Substack and just search Econoboi and I'll be right there. Cool. Where can people find your stuff, Neville?
Yeah, and I think you mentioned in your recent expos that occasionally you'll be still writing, which is really good. You have a couple of, I think, debates down the pipeline, but you're pretty much, limiting your online interactions. Maybe at some point, hopefully things will, balance themselves and hopefully maybe you'll come back from retirement. There were a lot of people that were posting that. So I think you'd be a great addition if you ever do come back in the future. Where could people find my work? Wilderness of Mirrors is my Substack page. You can get a lot of great information there. My podcast is New Ideas, which is on YouTube. And you could also find me on X under Nevin Gusak or NG874. That's my Twitter handle at NG874. So if you want to, if anybody out there would like to talk to me or have interviews or conversations, I try to keep it civil. There are things obviously you and I may not agree with, but we kept it civil. We kept it informed. I just generally like to have conversations and friendly debates and whatnot with people where I have at least some things in common with and some common agreement, but also differences. So yeah, I appreciate the time. Again, I wish you good luck and you be safe and, take care of yourself.
All right, you too. Talk to you later. Bye.
All right, take care now. Bye-bye.